Well, hello guys, welcome to an all-new episode of Insights, which is your favorite scientific talk show, or at least that's what I like to tell myself. And today we have a great guest, which I'm honored to present, Dr. Melanie Peffer, who has a bachelor's degree and a PhD in molecular biology from the University of Pittsburgh, and completed her postdoctoral training in learning sciences at Georgia State University. She's a teaching assistant professor and research scientist level 2 at the University of Colorado at Boulder. Her research is focused on how people learn biology, with an emphasis on teaching about the nature of science knowledge and how we can use educational technologies to assess students' understanding of science. Melanie is the author of the best-selling book, Biology Everywhere: How the Science of Life Matters to Everyday Life. Biology Everywhere is a journey through the science of life as told through our daily experiences. She is also the 2021 High Plains Library District Foundation's Writer-in-Residence. She will be spending her residency working on a children's spin-off series of Biology Everywhere. The first book, Biology Everywhere, River Adventures, released in December 2021. When not writing, Melanie enjoys playing her flute and piccolo and enjoying all that Colorado has to offer in the great outdoors with her husband and her son. So, Melanie, thank you so much for agreeing to doing this interview. How are you?
I'm doing well today. Thank you for having me, and thank you everyone for listening in today.
Excellent. So Melanie, I would like our conversation to start with why is understanding science important? For the general public, and how do people understand scientific knowledge?
Yeah, so it's a great question to kick off with. So one thing that I've observed that's really influenced my teaching and my research, and was a major reason I wrote Biology Everywhere and Now on the River, was how many people don't like science. They just kind of look at it and they're like, I'm not good at this, I'm not smart enough to do it. But at the end of the day, we don't really have a choice but to engage with science, because science is everywhere and there's a lot of scientifically minded decisions that we have to make every day. And it can be little things like choosing to recycle or not. It can be very, very big things. So we see this with the COVID-19 pandemic and things like global climate change that affect all of us, and other public health policies. And so that's why I think it's important to understand science, because it's going to come up and we have to be ready and confident in the decisions that we make about it.
Yes, and I think, for example, one of my motivations for starting this talk show was, well, I know that there are a lot of great scientific journalists, and but there's also a lot of not so great scientific journalists and a lot of misinformation. And I think us scientists rarely engage in science communication to the lay public, because sometimes we're more engaged with our academic writing. So how do you think actual researchers play a role in this, in science communication, I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a great question. Something that's very close to my heart as well is that there are wonderful, fabulous scientific journalists out there, but they don't have the science background. And so even if they're very, very good at their craft, they're still kind of getting it secondhand, so to speak. But a lot of times, unfortunately, scientists have a tendency to reinforce stereotypes about scientists as being, the old crazy white man that's unintelligible, and, they're just too smart. And so something that I do a lot of work is, how do we take these best practices from the scientific journalists and teach them to scientists who have that deep insight into what's going on, to help them be able to communicate it better. So a lot of the work that I do through consulting and coaching and volunteering is helping scientists learn how to translate their science to a general public audience.
Yeah, and that's great, because I do think a lot of scientists have this notion of the importance, but maybe well, if we're used to writing academic papers, it's sometimes I think there is a struggle between, okay, what I do write scientifically, but how do I tell it to other people?
Yes, because it's a very different style of writing. It's a lot of journalistic writing. You start with the main idea first, and then you put in the supporting points. And then when you think about scientific writing, you spend a lot of time building up to that take-home message. You get your theoretical framework or your rationale and your background in first, and then eventually you get to the point. So very different styles of writing, although I've really found too that the scientists who are really good at writing for the general public write better academic papers. They're the ones that I like to read and prefer to go and read. They just have better, it's a better writing style. So I when people are like, oh, well, you know, I can write these grants or I can write these academic papers. And I'm like, no, if you can write a good blog article for the general public, it'll make you better at all the other academic stuff too.
Okay, yeah, so even though it's a different writing style, what I'm understanding is that you have found that people who do have a writing skill can do it both ways, right?
I think if you can write for the general public, you can go both ways.
Okay.
If you can write for an academic audience, you cannot necessarily write for a general public audience.
Okay, I get it.
And then it's a completely different skill set entirely, as I found, to write a children's book. lots and lots of rounds of editorial help with the kids' book to get it into shape, because it was not what I thought it was going to be. So it's a lesson I'm relearning all the time too, is that there's always more to learn about writing.
Yeah, but I do think that learning science from a very young age is so important. And one of the guests here in the show was Paul Salum, who was a big man on TV for a number of years. And I can say that a lot of people in my network who are now scientists got their interest from these kind of projects that were aimed for children.
Oh, absolutely. You know, people ask me, why did I go into biology in the first place? And it's like, because I had some amazing biology teachers when I was in school. You know, I think about my 6th grade science teacher. She was a huge reason why I went into biology.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it can shape how people understand and embrace science for the rest of their lives.
Yeah, absolutely. And unfortunately, you know, kids get a lot of bad messages about science, and they either get it from their parents because their parents had some bad experience in school and they never wanted to come back to it. So if that happened to you, if you're listening and that happened to you, I'm sorry. You're not alone. It's happened to a lot of people, and kids hear those messages and they hear that science is hard or boring or only for smart, nerdy kids or whatever, or only for boys, unfortunately. And they shut down. And so that's why when I put On the River together, I intentionally made it with a brother-sister duo. And the sister is really gung-ho and excited about science. So she's kind of this mix of Miss Frizzle Ranger, and she wants to earn her adventurer badge. And then her little brother's like, no, I heard from the kids at school that science is too hard, and I don't think I'm any good at it. The big sister persuades her little brother to come out with him, and he finds, as they're trying to figure out if their local river is healthy or not, that science isn't what he thought it was. And they actually really like it.
Yeah, no, and that's great, because I think a lot of kids will relate, not only the ones that may not be interested in science, but they also have this character of the one that is interested in science and wants to teach her little brother. That's so great. Yeah,
I was trying to target it so that who didn't necessarily fit into the classroom when have a role model to look up to. And then people who don't feel like they can do science also have someone that they can follow. And it's interesting how many adults little brother character's name is Max. They strongly relate to Max's character. And, you know, that's part of my sneakiness with the kids' book, is that everybody likes and relates to picture books.
Yes.
It just feels like a universal genre. So what's the age group on your kids' book? And it's like, well, it's kind of targeting elementary school, but at the end of the day, it's really probably 0 to 99. Because Biology Everywhere was written for people who don't like science and biology. And the problem is that people who don't like science and biology do not go into the science section at bookstores or at the library.
Yes.
But people buy science kids. So it's another way I'm trying to reach the people and see if I can get them to science and biology another chance.
That's so great. And I would like if you could tell us a little bit about how, as a scientist, how your research has helped you understand or get a better understanding about how people consume science or understand science.
Yeah, absolutely. So my research background brings in two very different disciplines. And so my PhD, as you mentioned, molecular biology, and my postdoctoral training and work I've done over the last 7 years has been in the learning sciences. And so I have this perspective of somebody with an advanced PhD. So I've published biological research, very intimate understanding of how biological research works, but also this training on how people learn about science topics. And so as I've been working on my research, I'm particularly interested in what are called epistemological beliefs about science. And so epistemology is the field that was referring to knowledge, and an epistemological belief about science is what we have about the nature of science knowledge. What is science knowledge? What's the difference between science evidence and someone's opinion?
Yes.
And where does that knowledge come from? Is it that you get after doing some Google searches or after a lot of rigorous and so these beliefs people have about science knowledge, they influence how people learn in classrooms. They influence engage in society and what they're going to do with about masking, for example. The problem with beliefs is that most people can't fully articulate them. And so if you just ask them, they're going to give you what they think you want to hear. And so one of the that I've been trying to solve with my research project is how do we beliefs? And so educational technology piece comes in. So rather than what they believe, we put them in an authentic science scenario and watch what they do. So we look at their practices as a proxy for what they believe. So for example, what language people use. So we found that when they make conclusions at the end of an investigation, use a lot of what are called hedges by linguists. Things like maybe and support and could. And this reflects what's called the tentative nature of science knowledge. And that's what we know changes in light of new evidence. That's one of the most powerful aspects of the scientific enterprise.
Yes.
And so you can see that reflected in language that people use when they talk about science. And so also popped up with a lot of my science communication work and all too, because there's a cognitive phenomenon that explain how people engage with science, and things like motivated reasoning. And so something people aren't always fully conscious of, but then it was some kind of information, have some kind of underlying motives of how they want to interpret it and think about it. Biased processing that goes on.
Yes.
And so that's when you get people that will cherry pick, and why people will dig in so hard sometimes if you present them with scientific evidence doesn't jive. So motivated reasoning related to confirmation bias as well, where people just want to go with what they already thought. So as for working on my research in epistemological beliefs, I've also had a chance to read a lot of papers on bias and conceptual change, reasoning, and reading a lot about system 1 and system 2 thinking recently. So that's Daniel Kahneman's work, and thinking about how we apply all of this to science community.
Yeah, and I think that those are highly important matters because, well, we may have another group of people who are interested in science and who want to go and look and maybe increase their knowledge. But then we encounter like this problem of, okay, then what are good sources of knowledge, and how should I take what someone is trying to tell me, right? And I think these tools that you just mentioned are very important in order to develop some kind of critical thinking, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So we hear a lot more in the news recently about misinformation and disinformation.
Yes.
Words that are getting tossed around that I don't know if what they are or how to protect yourself from them, especially with a lot of the data with COVID-19, because so much of it is so new.
Yeah.
I think, and overwhelming, because there's the amount of new data that comes out every single. And so I think it all fits into that as well. For those of you who don't know, misinformation that's out there that's incorrect
Yes.
for whatever reason. So you're talking to someone about how some science principle works and they do it correctly. And so it's just a mistake. And so that's to kind of go back and check other sources as well and say, okay, well, do other people agree with this? I agree with it. Does this jive with what I know about science? Does this jive with what, public health organization like the WHO is saying? And that's very different from disinformation. So disinformation that is wrong, usually spread with some kind of malicious, whether that's dividing people or causing arguments or whatever ulterior motive one has. So we have misinformation, which is naive and just happens, and then disinformation is people intentionally trying to stir the pot.
Yes. So I believe you have or you teach some courses on this matter, right? That maybe I can direct people to.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have a motivated reasoning short course coming out probably early next year. It's in the illustration process right now. And then I have a massive open online course. So I have two MOOCs, or massive open online courses. One is on biology everywhere, and I have another one on science communication. And so these are freely accessible around the world. I'm thinking of expanding the science communication course out and including an entire section on misinformation and disinformation and what to do with it. But for the time being, you can check it out on Coursera. Again, it's completely free unless you want a certification from it. And I get into the science of learning, how we use the science of learning to design science communication and outreach, and then different modalities. So if you want to just get started, if you're a scientist who's interested in doing more outreach to the general public, include a lot of ideas for getting started, best practices. So really breaking down how to write for the general public versus a scientific audience, art-based forms of communication, technology-based forms of communication, and some just general tips for speaking to the general public as well.
That's so great. I'll make sure and leave the links in the description so people can go and maybe look into it if they're interested.
Yeah, absolutely. It's biology everywhere. It's been out a little bit longer, and the last I checked, it's getting close to 9,000 people from all around the globe who've taken the course. So I'm very pleased with how it's done.
That's so great. And I would like to talk a little bit. You mentioned earlier one area of research interests for you is how technology or learning technologies may help in science communication. What have you done research-wise in this area?
Yeah, so one of my professional societies that I interact with is the Society for Learning Analytics Research, or SOLAR. And learning analytics is a very new field. It's only about 10 years old, and it's getting into the data streams that are coming off of various technological platforms and figuring out what to do with it and what it tells us about people's learning. And so when I mentioned my research and trying to look at what people are doing as a proxy for their beliefs, they're in a computer-based environment when they do that. And so in that computer-based environment, we can track what they do. So those are called data traces. And so these data traces include what they're clicking on, how long it takes them to do things, their responses to prompts, what notes they put in their lab notebook, what tests they do, why they do those tests. And so we get this very rich picture of all the things that they do, and then can kind of make some inferences based on why they're doing it that way. And so learning analytics is the future, and it's very exciting to think about what kind of insights we'll get from technology about how people learn and how people are learning on computers. I mean, granted, that research has been going on for a while, but pandemic and people being home so much.
Yeah. Oh, I'm very curious to know. I mean, I know you mentioned it's a very young field of study and analysis, but what have we learned so far regarding how people learn and their behavior regarding science?
I think that's still a pretty open question. I think people are just starting to get into the extent of what we can do.
Mm-hmm.
And a couple of papers that I can think of where people have looked at like self-regulated learning in online science environments. There's a lot of intelligent tutoring systems that are out there that people are doing. There's a lot of things with virtual reality. And so having kids go out with goggles to some kind of cultural significant site and being able to engage on that different level. There's been lots and lots of research, computer-supported collaborative learning. So how do students learn when they're all sitting around an iPad together and playing some kind of game? So I also want to mention some research that I know that was done in South America that I thought was amazing. And it was a smart room that you could go in and practice giving a speech. And there was a bunch of sensors. And then the computer would give you feedback. And so you could go do it by yourself without anybody there.
Yes.
Some initial feedback before you actually gave the talk in front of. So that's a very brief sketch. If you would like more information, or if anybody information, I am the co-editor of Solar's Nexus blog. And it's a bunch of short tidbits in the analytics community for a broader audience of how to apply insights from the learning analytics field to classrooms and to technology design.
Oh, that's definitely very interesting, and I think a lot of it's very worth to look into it, because, well, I'm just amazed at this research in South America about people getting feedback without actually having to do their speeches maybe in front of an audience. I think it's very, very useful, and especially if people have like this kind of social phobia, right? And they want to make this like a successive approximation to maybe giving a lecture or giving a presentation or whatever.
Yeah, there's a growing community of analytics researchers in South America. I think themselves Lala. I would have to check that out, but it's Latin American Learning Analytics Group or something along those lines. If anyone's interested, I can find the information, but there is a growing group of researchers in Latin America who are doing learning analytics research.
That's so great, especially since we have some followers from South America. So that's just great. So Melanie, about regarding your science communication work, besides this couple of books that we've learned about, what other work, I'm sorry, are you typically engaged in?
I do a little bit of everything. That's one of the things I love about my job, is that I do a little bit of everything. So I've written books for the job. I do consulting. So I get to run workshops and I get to do coaching. People bring things to me that they're working on. So I do that co-editor and as a consultant. I also spend a lot of time just talking to people and figuring out how they tick public outreach. And so I do a lot of talks like this and podcast interviews and just getting to know people. That's where a lot of biology everywhere came from too, is just talking to people and saying, you know, what was your experience in science classes, and realizing how many people had bad science classroom experiences.
Yes.
Colored everything they ran into going forward. Also what makes people tick, what brings people to science, if they're going to re-engage, what makes them excited and brings them back in. I've had a lot of feedback on the public talks I've given about biology and the arts. People seem to miss that the arts and the sciences are very interwoven with one another. And one of the greatest science discoveries, or at least biological discoveries of all time, was Santiago Ramón y Cajal. I'm sorry if my pronunciation is terrible, but he was a scientist who wanted to be an artist. And he's the father of neuroscience, called the neuron doctrine, or that individual cells called neurons make up our brain, is he kept drawing them. He wanted to be an artist and not a scientist, winning the Nobel Prize for that.
Yes. Well, I actually think that I'll post in the video some artwork by Santiago Ramón y Cajal, so people maybe if they're not familiar with his work can see some of his artwork, which is amazing.
Yeah, it's beautiful, and it's all available in the public domain as well.
Yes.
And then you can check out, I did a TED Ed lesson on his work too.
Oh, that's excellent. I'll also leave the link. I'll just go ahead and leave every link I find regarding your work, so people can go and look into it, and maybe if they're interested, order your book, whatever they find most useful with respect to their interests, of course. So, Melanie, maybe to end the talk, I would like if you could tell us and maybe get people a little bit more curious and to read biology everywhere. What will they learn there when reading the book? And also, what will the children learn from the children's book?
Oh, that's such a good question. So, biology everywhere, I think people will learn a different take on biology. And so it's not the stereotypical presentation of biology with lots of terms and lots of facts. Someone asked me once, they're like, oh, if you're a biologist dissecting animals, I'm like, no, actually, I really don't. That's not my idea. Something I want to do. And so I would say biology, people who want to move past the biology stereotypes and really think about a lot of the fascinating ways we run into biology every day. One of my most popular social media posts, we were cooking bacon for breakfast, picture of it, and it was just like, oh, protein biochemistry.
Yeah.
And so just little things like that we usually don't think about. And then the last third of biology everywhere is my favorite part of the book, because it's biology as it relates to other disciplines. And I think a lot of those connections are very surprising for people. So there's a chapter on biology and psychology, there's biology in the arts, there's biology in business, education. And I think that very much surprises people. I really don't think of those things as being so interrelated with one another.
Yeah, and I think that's great in maybe confronting a kind of idea that people have that sciences are like these individual fields of study that are not interrelated with one another, and that it is maybe a static core of knowledge, like a textbook, right? When in reality, right, quite dynamic, it's always changing, and we have a lot of transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary work.
Yes.
Because well, there are just some phenomena that maybe one particular field of study falls short when trying to explain. So you have to deal with mathematicians, with physicians. I mean, in my field of work, which is neuroscience, well, there are a lot of us trying to make sense of a particular result.
Absolutely. And I think that surprise for people is how much people work across boundaries. And that's a big thing that influenced the book. And a lot of the research, again, I switched from hard sciences into soft sciences, so to speak, with learning sciences. With On the River, I think what kids will get out of it is that, again, science isn't what they think it is. Mm-hmm. And that anyone can do it, and that it's very different and can be a lot of fun. And so one of the things with On the River is at the end, there's this trail guide. And so it's designed so that kids can take their copy of the book and go down and find some of these same creatures. So for the older kids, it's got more details in there that they can look up on their own. And then with On the River, it's based on a river that runs through my town. And then I tried to pick examples that are universal to all rivers.
Okay.
Because my hope is, especially this is part of why I wanted to target late elementary as well, is that that's the developmental time when girls start to fall behind, children of color start to fall behind. And that's when kids start to feel like they're not a science person anymore. And so I was hoping with this strong sense of place. I'm in Colorado, and anybody who lives in our body water sees osprey. See these animals that when you can connect the book science with animals that you see every day, it starts to help people feel strong. So a strong sense of pride and I like where I'm from. And that also connects with their identity just as well. I can do this. I can look for birds. And this is doing science and being able to label and make these observations. And so it's designed to give students that sense of place and sense of identity with being a science person in the place where they're in.
Yeah, no, that's so great. I love the idea, and I mean, it's just wonderful. Melanie, I don't want to take a lot more out of your time, which you so kindly gave to us. But I do have one last question. What would be like an advice that you give to scientists mainly regarding well, science communication and all that we've been talking to?
Yeah, absolutely. That's another great question. I would, this is a two-part piece of advice. And the first is just to try it. And then if you're going to try it, remember that in science, we base things on evidence. And the practice of science communication and how people learn is also an evidence-based field too.
Yes.
And so I think some people are afraid to try. And so that's why I'm like, all right, well, just if you have an idea, try it. But it comes with that caveat of there's good and bad ways of doing science. And there's doing science communication too. And if you're not sure, they can reach out to me and ask, or check out my online courses, or there's a lot of fantastic science communication communities out there, evidence-based research. People want that information.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Melanie, for, well, not only for this advice, but for everything that you shared with us. And well, I hope that this bit of piece of conversation makes people curious enough to go and learn more about science, particularly biology, which is your field of work. And thank you so much. I'm so grateful for this interview.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me. It was fun.
Well, have a great day, Melanie. Thanks.
Thank you.